within the ESSA sport project.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Bore da, that's an Englishman trying to speak Welsh, which is not very usual. Just to say a few words about myself. So I have had a 40-year career in technical and vocational education and training, which unfortunately is often seen as the sometimes despised and poor relation of higher education. But throughout this career, whenever I've been a manager of teams, I've always said to my team members, what is our goal? Our goal is to get people into good jobs and progressive careers. And given everything that Steve said this morning about employability, I am delighted to be involved in this project, because I have to confess that in the past, I have been a bit of a stern critic of higher education, of universities, in what I saw as being their failure not to focus enough on the employability of graduates. And therefore, I see this as being a great opportunity to be involved in the project. I'm very much looking forward to working with people like Steve and Colin and Ivan that I know from other projects. And I am convinced that this is going to be a great success. Now, this morning, I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to be talking about two streams of work that we did within the ESSA sport project. The first one is about available statistics. And then the second one is going to be about what we found out from an employer skills survey that was carried out as part of the ESSA project. In total, I've got about 50 slides to get through. So I'm hoping you all had a very strong cup of coffee during the comfort break to keep you awake during this process. Okay, so next slide, please, Ben. Just to say a few words about the methodology. Sorry, Ben hopped forward a little bit. No. Talking about the SSA project, what we were trying to do is to engage the whole of the sport and physical activity sector at both the EU and the national level. We had 25 partners involved in the project, and we produced national reports on all of what were then the EU 28 countries. We wanted to raise the profile and understanding of the sport and physical activity sector. We wanted to undertake, as far as we could, a real analysis of the labour market and what employers saw as being the skills, needs and priorities for the whole of the sector. So we're not just talking here about management and leadership, we're talking about the whole of the sector and the occupations within the sector. We very much wanted to identify the realities and challenges facing the sector. That, of course, was up to 2019. And then we wanted to create a sector response as the basis for action. And when Ben was talking about the S2A project, he talked about the importance of moving from strategy to action. And therefore, as part of the project, we wanted to identify the concrete priorities and some recommendations for the sector into the future. And then all of that was formalized through an action plan, which we developed as a basis for the sector, which we hope will help it to achieve its potential and meet its challenges. Now, obviously, it was a very ambitious project, a very detailed project. And within all of that, there is an awful lot which I cannot in any way cover in the presentation this morning. So we would encourage you all, please, to go to the ESSA website. And from the website, you can download the EU report, which covers the whole of the European Union. And there are national reports for each one of the EU 28, and they are available in 20 different languages, as you will see, I think, in a minute. So there's an awful lot of data and information available in that report, and all we're going to be doing today is picking up on some of the main issues. So our objectives were to collate and analyze available statistics, identify the total number of people employed in the sector, and we'll say a little bit more in a minute about how we define the sector. We wanted to understand better the main characteristics of the sport labour market, and what we wanted to do, of course, was to look at, insofar as we could with the available statistics, to look at breakdowns by gender, by age, by type of employment, contract, by level of education, etc., etc. And as we said earlier, to highlight the realities, challenges, and tendencies. And one of the big objectives, of course, was wide dissemination and consultation with sport stakeholders. And in fact, there were, I think there were national workshops in 20 of the countries, Ben, in order to feed into the national reports that came out at the end of that process. So we went through quite a long process of research, consultation, etc., etc. As we said earlier, there were two streams of research, and I'm going to report on both of those, just picking out some of the main points. The first stream of the research was statistics on the European sport labour market, and then the second one was the European Employers Skills Survey. And I'm sure Steve will make these presentations available to all of you, but you can see that there is an ESSA-Sport EU report, which is available to you from that link. Now, Ben, we seem to have gone back to the first slide. Oh no, we're moving to, right, we're now moving, sorry, this is your prompt to move me into the next bit. Okay, so if we could go on to the next slide, where we're going to be looking at the available statistics. Now, the first thing to say is just to give you a few words about the sources for the data and where we got the data from. The first main source of the data was Eurostat. Eurostat carried out a labour force survey, centralised from all the national statistical offices across the European Union. It is available each year, and there is a breakdown by quarter, which is very helpful because it gives you a more granulated view of what is happening in terms of developments. It covers the whole of the EU 28. However, the level of detail available is not necessarily uniform across all countries. So in the case of some countries, you will get quite a detailed level in terms of the statistics. In other countries, it's not quite as detailed. It's probably the most consistent source of statistics, but there is some missing data, particularly when it applies to individual nations. We also draw on national statistics offices across the EU. These are not always available, as we discovered, very easily available. They draw on various sources, for example, labour force surveys and employer data, etc. They use quite often different methodologies. Sometimes it's not available for free. You have to pay a fee in order to access the data. As we said earlier, there's a variety of detail across the different countries, but they do provide usefully national points of contact in order to scrutinise and ask more questions, etc. Thank you, Ben. Right, now, of course, we have to talk about the presentation of the data, and it's valuable, I think, to issue the health warning right at the beginning. We were using the best information and data available from the official statistical sources that we talked about earlier on, but it is not necessarily the exact reality. And of course, everybody involved in this discussion this morning is going to be aware probably of that phrase that was made very famous by Mark Twain, who said there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. So he was implying that statistics were even worse than lies and damn lies. And I think we're all aware of that background. So the statistics are only figures. They don't necessarily capture everything. We believe that the sector is still underestimated. And part of that is to do with the methodology that's used for the labour market, the labour force surveys. So they don't collect information on second jobs, for example. And one of the things that we know is that A number of people in the sector have so-called portfolio careers. They have a main job, which might be in a different sector, and then they have a second job in sport and physical activity. Well, the labour force surveys don't pick that up, unfortunately. We've got the issue of seasonality, so the statistics are collected every quarter, but we know that in some subsectors within sport and physical activity, seasonal employment is an important feature. And then, of course, in many countries, we have the issue of the hidden economy, and therefore people are employed, but they aren't necessarily officially employed, and therefore they don't show up on the labour force surveys either. So there are a number of complications in all of this that need to be borne in mind. We know that the information and the data that we collected need to be supported with a qualitative approach, and that's why we organised a number of national workshops in order to bring in stakeholders at the national level. So, for example, Ben and I led a workshop in the UK a couple of years ago. I think Steve was present at that workshop. Colin came to the workshop, I think, or someone else from SIMSPA. So, and that was replicated in many of the other countries who participated in the project. So, what we were trying to do then was to say, well, look, guys, this is what we found out so far. Does this actually relate to your lived experience or what is actually happening in your country? And that was very valuable as well, because that helped to put a kind of qualitative envelope around a lot of the data that had been collected. One of the goals was to create discussions and debates, and you know, we developed an action plan to come out of the project, as we indicated earlier on, and these discussions and debates are ongoing, and what we're doing this morning is actually part of that. And then, of course, we came out with recommendations and priority actions.
Thanks. I think somebody's not on mute. If it's possible for everybody to mute. Thank you. Next slide, Jeff.
Okay. Yes, please. Okay, so we need to say a few words now about the headings under which we collected the data. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the NACE codes. The NACE codes, NACE stands for Nomenclature of Economic Activities. So this is one way in which the European Union classifies the labour market, or classifies the workforce. And all of this comes under a heading of 93.1. And 93.1 you can see broken down there, but basically it's sports activities. And we're looking at the operation of sports facilities, sports clubs, fitness facilities, and other sports activities. So basically, under NACE code 93.1, we're looking at people working in organisations whose main business is the provision of sport and physical activity. So that's one thing that we looked at. And then, Ben, if you move on to the next slide, please. We looked at the ISCO codes. Now, ISCO is the International Standard Classification of Occupations. It derives from the International Labour Office in Geneva. And it's adapted by the European Union in order to generate codes for occupations. So if you think back to the NACE codes we're talking about organizations, and in the case of the ISCO codes, we're talking about occupations, the jobs that people actually do. And in this case, we were looking at ISCO 342. It comes under the broad heading of technicians and associate professionals, but 342 is sport and fitness workers. 342, 3 digits, and you can see 4 digits broken down under that heading. So we're looking at athletes and sports players, in this case professionals, in other words, people whose main occupation is either as an athlete or sports player. We were looking at sports coaches, instructors, and officials. They're all blocked together under one ISCO code. And then finally, we're looking at fitness and recreation instructors and program leaders. Okay, so those, in terms of those people who had a sports-specific occupation, we're looking at those 3 groups there. Now, one of the frustrations for me in terms of the ISCO codes is that sport and leisure managers or sport and physical activity managers are not classified under 342. They come under a different heading, which is for other services managers. And it's actually very difficult to analyze because that level of data at that level of granularity is not available across the European Union. So it's very, very hard to actually identify specifically how many sport and leisure or sport and physical activity managers there are actually across the European Union. And I think that's an area where we have gone back to Eurostat. So our colleague Aurelian, who led on this project, has gone back to Eurostat. He's raised this issue. And I think there is going to be further discussion about how we might get more granular data to do with people who've got a management role in the sector. Next slide, please, Ben. Okay, so this is a summary of what I've just told you. So we've been looking at persons who have a sports-specific occupation in an organisation whose main business is the provision of sport. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. Second thing to bear in mind, which is also really important, is that there are persons who have a sports-specific occupation in an organisation whose main business is not the provision of sport. So when we're talking here about the sport and physical activity labour force across the whole of the European Union, we are also taking account of people who have a sports job, but for example, they might be a fitness instructor in a hotel, they might be a sports coach in a rehabilitation centre, for example. So what we try to do is to reach out into other sectors to identify these people, because legitimately we think these people are part of the EU labour force. And then we're looking at people who have a non-sport specific occupation, in other words, other ISCO codes, in an organisation whose main business is the provision of sport. So they are working for a sports organisation, but they're not a sports specific occupation. So they could be a generic manager in a sport federation. They could be a receptionist or an admin worker in a sport club, for example. So what we tried to do is to take all of those groups in a totality and identify those as being the sport and physical activity labour force across the EU. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, we are now going to, given you all of that kind of background, we're now going to try to tell you some, but only a very small sum of what we found out in the course of all of this. So the breadth of what we did in terms of time was from 2011 to, in terms of the report, it was up to 2018, but we've been able to supplement 2019 figures as well. So what we're showing you here is from 2011 to 2019. Now, in this case, we are looking at people who are working in a sports organisation. So that's NACE 93.1. And what we discovered was that it was from about 1 million people across the whole of the European Union in 2011, rising to just over 1,300,000 in 2019. So what we can tell you is that from 2011 to 2019, there was an uplift of 26.6% in terms of the size of the workforce, people working in sports organisations. And as you can see, there was quite a significant uplift from 18 to 19 by 2.6%. Thank you, Ben. Okay. Now, when we take the totality of the sport labour market, so this is now including people who have sport-specific occupations, but they are working in organisations whose main business is not sport and recreation. So we're taking everything together, sports organisations and non-sports organisations, but people who've got a sport occupation. We can see that from 2011 to 2019, the workforce increased by nearly 21%. And again, from 2018 to 19, there was again a significant uplift of 1.5%. So what we can see is that in both cases, we can see that the labour force as a whole has increased quite significantly over that period of time, the 8 or 9 years that we're talking about there. In this case, the totality of the labour force. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, what we also discovered by comparing it with the labour market in the European Union as a whole, because obviously population increases, number of people employed in all sectors increases over that period of time. What we wanted to do was to see, well, is the labour force in sport and physical activity increasing just at the same rate as every other sector, every other economic sector, or is it actually increasing or decreasing? And interestingly, we discovered that as a proportion of the total EU labour force, it had increased from that period 2011 to 2019. So in 2011, it was 0.7% of the total labour force, but by 2019, it was 0.79%. So what we're saying here is it's not just the fact that the labour force has increased in numbers over that period of time. As a proportion of the total labour market in the EU, it's gone up by 0.9%. Which may not sound very much, but when you consider the number of people employed across the what was then the 28 nations of the European Union, that's actually quite a significant relative growth, I think. Next slide, please, Ben. So what we also tried to do was to look at different factors or different characteristics in that labour market. And what we also did was to make comparisons with the EU labour force as a whole. So when you're looking at the chart in the centre of the screen, it's showing you what has happened in terms of male and female employment. And then the two graphics on the right-hand side of the screen give you a comparison with the EU labour market as a whole. So what we can see in this case is that the number of females, which is the orange line on the screen there, has in fact decreased. It's decreased by around about 2% over that period of time, 2011, 2019. And obviously the number of males has gone up by the same percentage. When you compare the proportions of people employed, male and female, with the labour market as a whole, this is all sectors, all economic sectors across the European Union, you see that it's not broadly different. You could say that the number of females employed is slightly smaller, but it's by less than 1%. So it's not significantly different to the rest of the EU labour market. But you can see that over that period of time, as far as sport and physical activity is concerned, there has been a tendency for the number of males to be employed to increase and a tendency for the number of females employed to go down. Next slide, please. Then we looked at type of working contract. And this is more significant, I think. So what you can see, the blue line represents full-time employment, and the orange line or the yellow line, depending on your screen, represents part-time employment in this case. And what you can see over this period of time is that the level of full-time and part-time employment has remained relatively the same across that period of time. You can see some ups and downs across the 8 to 9 year period. But when you compare it with the EU labour market as a whole, the differences are actually quite interesting. So if you look at the EU labour market as a whole, 18.5% are employed on part-time contracts. But in the case of sport and physical activity, we discover that 43.7% are employed on part-time contracts. And that's really quite a significant difference, which needs to be borne in mind. I think it would be interesting to compare it with not just the labour market as a whole, but also similar service industries, because you may find, for example, in hospitality, in some of these other sectors, service sectors, you might find similar employment patterns. But that makes it significantly different to the EU labour force as a whole. Thanks, Ben. And then we looked at by type of employment. So in this case, we were looking at people who were on employed contracts and people who were self-employed. And given what Steve was saying this morning about entrepreneurship and self-employment in the sector, this is actually quite interesting, because we can see that over that period of time, 11 to 19, you can see there has been what I think is a significant uplift in the level of self-employment across the sport and physical activity sector. It's about 3%. And obviously there's been a similar decline in full-time employed contracts. But then when you compare it with the rest of the EU labour force, there is a significant difference. So we can see that in the case of sport and physical activity, we're talking about roughly 22% being self-employed by comparison with 14% in the labour force as a whole. Thanks, Ben. And then we looked at age. And this again was interesting. So we have three lines on the screen here. The line which is in orange, and this is the largest proportion of those employed in sport and physical activity, fall into the 25 to 49 year age group. And what we can see from this is that over that period, that number has declined. So we see that it's gone down by about 4% over that period of time. The line which is in blue are the number of people classified as young workers, and these are people in the 15 to 24 age group. So when we talk about graduates from universities, they are going to, in most cases, they will fall within this blue group. And they have remained relatively static over that period of time. So it's 22.4% in 11, going slightly up to 22.64% in 19, which is not really that significant, I guess. However, you'll see we also have that grey or silver line, and this represents the over 50s, and you'll see the over 50s in this case have gone up from 19% in 2011 to 23% in 2019, which suggests overall that we do have an aging workforce. But again, given general demographics in all sectors, you would probably say that's not necessarily unusual. The population within the EU is aging, and a lot of people are choosing perhaps to continue to work after the opportunity to take retirement. So it's not necessarily that unusual. If you compare it with the EU labour market as a whole, you'll see that the people in the 15 to 24 age group is significantly bigger. So it's nearly 3 times the number of people in other sectors. So by comparison with other sectors, and again, this is given the nature of the sport and physical activity sector, this is not necessarily surprising, but we see that almost 3 times as many people in the 15 to 24 age group are employed in sport and physical activity by comparison with other sectors across Europe. 25 to 49 age group is slightly smaller than the average across Europe. And then you look at the 50 plus group, and you will see it's significantly smaller than those. So the conclusion you can probably draw overall is that we have a younger workforce than most other industrial sectors across the EU. And of course, that's significant for us, particularly when it comes to education, training, and career development. Next slide, please, Ben. And then we also looked at level of education. And you can probably say that this follows a trend across the European population as a whole in most countries. So again, we have 3 coloured lines here. The blue line actually, I can't see the key on the bottom, Ben. Could you unmute and just remind me what the 3 lines are here?
Yeah, orange line is medium, grey line is high, and blue line is low.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So what we can see from this is that the number of people with low qualifications, these were all judged in terms of the European qualification framework and the formal education qualifications that people said that they held. We can see that the number of people with low qualifications has gone down by about 4% over that period of time. The number of people with high qualifications, so these are qualifications at bachelor, I think it's bachelor degree level and above, has gone up quite considerably by about 10% over that period of time. And obviously, the number of people in the medium qualification, educational qualification level attainment has gone down over that period. So what we can see is that the educational level in terms of formal educational qualifications has actually increased over that period of time. But it's not significantly different. It is different, but perhaps not significantly different to the EU workforce as a whole. We can see that the number of people with higher level qualifications is probably about 2% greater than can be found in most other industries across or the average in industries across the EU. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, what we're now doing is we're switching the focus. So what we're now doing is looking at those people. This was if you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, this is now looking at occupations and those people who fall under the ISCO code 342. So this is the number of people with sport and fitness occupations. And just to remind you, these are professional athletes and sports players, coaches, instructors and officials, and fitness instructors. That's the key on the other side. Now, in this case, you can see that there has been a considerable increase. So if you think about the sport and recreation workforce as a whole, when we were talking about NACE 93.1, it had gone up by some significant percentage points. But in this case, we can see that those people with a sport-specific occupation has gone up quite significantly. It's almost 23% over that period of time. So there appears to be a tendency for quite a strong growth in people with sport and fitness occupations. But just to remind you that in the context of this project, the project we're talking, the project that we're all involved in here, this does not include sport and leisure managers, sport and physical activity managers. We're only talking about the players and athletes, the instructors, coaches, and fitness people. But there's been quite a considerable uptick there. And you can see even from 2018, 2019, it's gone up by 3%, which was quite significant, I think. Next slide, please, Ben.
You need this one.
So if we look at a breakdown there, so these are all the people who fall under ISCO 342, the athletes, sports players, coaches, instructors, officials, and the fitness and recreation instructors. We can see that of that group, 8% are our professional athletes and sports players. The biggest group is obviously, well, from this slide here, are the sports coaches, instructors, and officials, who are in at 57, nearly 58%. And then the fitness and recreation instructors and program leaders are there at just over a third, 34.3%. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, I've only shown you a very, very tiny fragment of everything that we found. So what we've tried to do here is just summarize some of the key facts, although you might want to take the word facts with a certain degree of skepticism, given everything we said about statistics. But what we can say with a certain level of confidence and probability is that there is a growing EU 28 sport labour market in terms of numbers. So obviously the United Kingdom was still included in the research that took place. That's why I refer to EU 28 here. It's a growing sector when compared to the employment, total employment across the whole of the EU, in other words, all industrial sectors, there has been quite a significant growth by comparison with other sectors. There is a difference between countries, and we haven't gone into that in detail in this presentation, but the proportion of people employed in some countries, in particular the UK, Denmark, the proportion of the workforce involved in sport and physical activity is pretty high by comparison with some other countries, in Romania and some of the other countries, where it appears to be relatively low. But all of that needs to be taken in the context of the fact that the statistics don't necessarily give an accurate picture, particularly because of the so-called hidden economy. So in some of the countries where the proportion of people engaged in sport and physical activity seems to be low from the official statistics, it could actually be much higher because people are not reporting. Because if they did report, they would then open themselves up to income tax and other embarrassments of that kind. So there are differences between countries, but that needs to be explored in greater detail. What we can say in terms of the main characteristics is that there are more male than female as paid staff. There is a growing proportion of youth and those in the 50+ year age group. There's a higher percentage of people on part-time contracts versus the EU average. And then there's a higher percentage of self-employed people versus the EU average. There are more workers with higher education qualifications than the EU average. And then, Ben, if you could just move the slide up a little bit so I can see the final bullet point. Oh, that was the final bullet point. Okay, that's fine. So that's a summary. Please, as background to the DSMLE project, please go to ESSA-sport.eu and please have a look at the full report, because I think you would find a lot more detail there. And in particular, if you want to look at it from the point of view of your own country, there will be national reports for all of the EU 28 there as well. So you can look at the EU statistics as a whole, and you can look at breakdowns for your own country. Now, all of that research was done before December 2019. And we all know what happened in 2019. We started to read reports about a strange new virus that was emerging in the Chinese city of Wuhan. And we didn't at that time understand fully what the impact of that could be. Now, our colleague Aurélien, who's based in France, has done more work with Eurostat to try to get a better understanding of what the impact of COVID-19 has been on the sport and physical activity sector. And what we can give you is similar statistics for the first semester of 2020. In other words, the first 2 quarters of 2020. The next 2 quarters of 2020, statistics are not yet available, but as soon as they become available, we can make the DSMLE project aware of where we stand in terms of the whole of 2020. Next slide, please, Ben. Right, now, this unfortunately is the bad news. So everything that I said up to now has been pretty good news. We can see that the labour market, the number of people employed in the total sport and physical activity labour force was going up. It was going up as a proportion of the total EU labour force. We could see all the good things that were happening. But now we have to confront the reality of where we are at the moment. So if you take total sport employment, and that definition is now, as I gave you at the beginning, so this is all the people employed in organisations whose main business is sport and physical activity, plus all those people who have sports or physical activity occupations, but may be employed in other sectors. And unfortunately, you can now see that the number of people employed up to the end of the second quarter of 2020 has now gone down by 3.3%, which is pretty similar to the gain that we saw that was made from 2018 to 2019. So all of the gains in terms of employment from 18 to 19 have now been lost in terms of employment. And if you look at that in terms of total sport employment by gender, first of all, we can see that the number of male employees has only gone down by minus 1.3%. And for all the women who are sitting and listening to this presentation, you will probably say, I told you so, or isn't that always the case? You can see that there has been a major hit on the number of women employed. So the number of women employed in the first 2 quarters of 2020, by comparison with where we were at the end of 2019, has gone down by nearly 10%, which we feel is quite significant. But you know, if you're aware of the way in which labour markets operate, you wouldn't necessarily be surprised for a whole range of social, economic, and cultural factors. Thanks, Ben. Can we go on to the next slide? And then we looked at age groups. So you can see that, in fact, in terms of age, the median age group, that was the age group in the under 50, 25 to under 50 group, actually went up during that period. Now, you know, we have to look at reasons why employment in some groups has remained static or even gone up, and of course that may be because of some of the employment support programs that have been put in place by the European Union and the different national countries. In the UK, it's called the furlough scheme, but it's there to keep people in employment even if their businesses have had to shut down temporarily, etc. So you can understand why there might have been growth in some, in this case, age groups. And even in the over 50 age group, you can see that there has been, again, an increase. And this might simply be because over those quarters, the age group, the workforce has actually aged. So that could also explain it. But unfortunately, when you look at the blue line, and just to remind you, the blue line is the 15 to 24-year age group, that's gone down by 17%. Which in the context of our project, the DSMLE project, this could well be significant because we can see that there is probably a growing reluctance on the part of employers to bring in new employees, and particularly new employees in that age group who may lack experience and skills, etc., etc. So there's a worrying trend there that we've identified for the first 2 quarters of 2020. And then finally, Ben, I think if you can move on to the next one, which looks at by type of working contract. Now, again, you can see that over that period of time, there has been an increase in the number of people on full-time employed contracts. But once again, you can see there has been a decrease in the number of people in part-time contracts. Now, we can all speculate. We don't have any research to back this up. You could speculate about some of the reasons for this. So you could say, well, maybe in order to take advantage of the employment support programs, the furlough schemes, as we call it in the UK, some employers, maybe they've been able to shift some of their part-time employees onto full-time contracts. I don't know. And I don't know if that's even legally possible, but that could possibly explain why we have an apparent growth in the number of full-time employees by about 50,000. It's not huge, but also that very significant drop in the number of part-time employees. And I think if we move on to the next slide, Ben, this is looking at, this is not looking at people who are working in sport-specific organisations, but this is looking at those people who have sport-specific occupations. So these are the professional athletes, the coaches, the physical activity instructors, etc. That has gone down in the first 2 quarters of 2020 by just over 4%. That's where we are at the moment. And Ben, I think if you move us on to the next slide, if you can.
Yeah, done.
Can't see it at the moment.
What are you seeing?
Still seeing NACE 93.1. few days ago, Aurélien, our colleague in France, who's in close contact with the European Commission and Parliament, etc., sent us the European Parliament briefing on COVID-19. And this is as of January 2021. So it's very, very hot off the presses. And again, we can give you a link or we'll send it on to Steve. So Steve can distribute it to all of the partners in this project. So you can look at the whole thing. We've only picked out a summary of one of the, basically it's a summary of one of the paragraphs. It's quite long. It's not a long report. It's a report of about 10 or 12 pages in total. It's briefing. But I have to say that it presents quite a pessimistic outlook for the sport sector. So what they are forecasting is 15% loss of direct sport-related gross domestic products. So that equates to about 47 million euros across the whole of the European Union. 16% loss of sport-related jobs. They estimate that could amount to about 845,000. Now, having said that, please pay attention to the bullet points at the bottom of the screen, because the European Union, European Commission, Parliament tend to use the Vilnius definition for sport employment, which is not the same as the definition that we used. It's not the same as the Eurostat figures collated by EOSE. So they take a wider definition of employment in sport and physical activity. But so we might be saying, well, in terms of the figures that we presented to you earlier on, thank God it may not amount to 845,000, but it's still based on European Parliament forecasts, it's still going to be significant, no question about it. And then taking account of the impact on services which are closely related to sport. So in this case, we're talking about industries or sectors like travel, tourism, infrastructure, buildings and stadiums and facilities and all that kind of thing. Media, broadcasting, etc. Losses could reach somewhere in the region of 79 million, nearly 80 million euros and 1.2 million jobs. So I'm very sorry to have to close on rather a pessimistic note, but it has to be the elephant in the room that we all need to confront as far as all of these projects are concerned. EOSE has got 4 major projects starting this year. They're all to do in one way or another with employment and skills in the sport and physical activity sector. And we know that at least 3 out of 4 of those projects are going to be severely impacted by COVID. So key facts on this one, obviously the same health warning about statistics, particularly the way in which, I just tried to point out to you, the way in which that European Parliament briefing characterises or defines sport employment. And all the other things that we said about lies, damn lies and statistics, but nevertheless, looking at the analysis for quarters 3 and 4 when available, so we'll try to update you on when those figures become available. But based on quarters 1 and 2, looking at tendencies, there is a decrease in total sport employment for the first time since 2011. I don't think any of us would be surprised by that, but as somebody pointed out to me recently, there's a difference between surprise and shock. So you can be not necessarily surprised by something, but you could be shocked when it happens because of the impact that it's going to have. When you look at a decrease in both ISCO 342 and 93.1, those are occupations and businesses. The most impacted categories so far are females, young workers under the age of 25, 15 to 24. And then, of course, as we said at the beginning, earlier on in the presentation, the part-time. And again, I apologize for finishing on a pessimistic note, but that is the end of the presentation on the ESSA sport project.
Thanks, Jeff. I couldn't see the chat function there, so I'm just seeing if there's anything in there. Colin's saying similar statistics for the UK, and there's he's linked to a report there as well. So that'll be useful to take a look at from the UK perspective, and probably the same work is taking place in other countries as well. So very quickly, you can see if there's any further questions or comments in the chat or verbally for Jeff.
Can I come in, Jeff?
Yeah.
I think it's really. I think it's a reality for us as a project team to have that sobering reality of where we are right now. I think all Erasmus projects in this round are going to have to think and accommodate the impact of COVID. I think having been part of the discussions with this the project you've just outlined, both in the initial rounds and more recently looking at this COVID impact, you've mentioned that extrapolating and looking at the granular sports management data is difficult, but having been part of the conversation, I know that we were able to at least identify some emerging themes, so I think the idea that our younger workforces are certainly in those more vulnerable contracts, the part-time contracts and other types of contracts was quite stark, and that self-employment figure, when you look at fitness and sports coaching in isolation, is even higher. And likewise, when you look at the age group, when you just get a little bit of insight, and it's difficult to tease it all out, but the managerial workforce seems to be that little bit older than the actual physical delivery workforce, if I'm to put it that way, sports coaches. And
I think it's definitely something that we're going to have to bear in mind. I think we do have. I spent a lot of time. Ben did warn me at the beginning that I tend to talk a lot, and I spent a long time talking about the statistics. We did point out there were two streams of research, and the other one was looking at the skills survey. Ben, I think we could probably show a little bit of the skills survey if you could just take us through to the bit on managers. Is that okay?
Yes.
So just to remind you, we did a survey of, it was nearly, and we managed to collect feedback from nearly 4,000 respondents. We had 3,812 valid responses. They did vary a little bit by country, but I think if you could, Ben, just take us through to the, yeah, okay. So what we did as part of the skills survey is we asked employers to comment on 8 categories of workers, and two of the categories of workers were middle managers and senior level managers. So I can't remember, Ben, whether we asked any questions about supervisors, but anyway, the presentation, or the very small number of slides I'm going to show you now, address the issue of middle and senior level managers. So what we did was to ask, first of all, what do you think the first top 5 important skills are in the area of management? And again, this is all within sport and physical activity businesses, public, private sector businesses, voluntary sector businesses, etc. Number 1, teamworking. Number 2, problem solving skills. Number 3, organizational and planning skills. Number 4, verbal communication skills. Number 5, the ability to work in compliance with codes of practice and ethics. So in terms of analysing the job, management job, that's what people identified as being the most important skills as far as they were concerned. And then the next one, we then asked them, what do you think in terms of your own managers, senior and middle managers, what do you think the weakest skills are? And the ones that came up were strategic thinking, leading change, business development skills. And of course, the business development skills are close to the entrepreneurial skills, which feature as part of the DSMLE project. I'm still learning to say it. Marketing and sales skills. And then again, because innovation is a feature of the project, facilitating innovation. So those first 5 were seen as being the weakest ones. And then, Ben, we did a calculation based on the data that we collected to try to work out what we thought, based on the responses, the nearly 4,000 responses we got, the top 5 priorities from the survey were in terms of these are training priorities or training and development priorities. And they were strategic thinking, number 1, leading change, number 2, business development skills, which is going to intersect with the entrepreneurial theme that we have within this project, leadership skills, and of course we're going to be exploring the career pathways of leaders as part of this project, and facilitating innovation, which again is a strong theme in the DSMLE project. So I think that's probably all that we need to say, Ben, in terms of those are probably the most relevant points I felt that came out of it. In terms of legacy, we could move on very quickly to that. I think so. This is what we propose to do.
The main
the main themes. Continuing research. So Aurélien and Thibault, the two colleagues in France, continue to work closely with Eurostat in order to update the employment statistics. Maximising the potential of our knowledge is dissemination, and obviously what I've been doing today and what Ben's been doing today is part of that process of trying to spread the word and get knowledge shared. We do feel there's a case for supporting sport-specific workers in other sectors, so those who work in hospitality or health, for example, because there aren't necessarily infrastructures in place to help them. There is a big issue around workforce diversity and inclusion. That came up as a very strong theme. And then there was the issue of continuing professionalization. And then, Ben, the next slide. I think I've already covered those things. In terms of the employer skills survey, we are planning to begin or to put in a project bid to European Commission to do under Erasmus Plus, I think, to do that again starting in 2022. So we'll do a further employer skills survey there. And the other major thing that we feel we need to do is to look more carefully at the volunteer workforce, which may not be so significant in terms of what we're talking about in this project. And then there was some of the conclusions that came out of continuing professionalization. And there was a very strong theme, again, that came back to the employers, encouraging employers and training providers to work more closely on those training priorities, to work together with training providers, further education colleges, universities, etc., to work more closely together, to develop and promote strategies to improve skills and competences of volunteer workers, develop programs to raise customer service standards, develop and promote strategies for stronger partnerships. And of course, this is a very strong theme within this project, stronger partnerships between employers and education and training providers. And again, develop and promote strategies to help employers improve recruitment, retention, and the continuing professional development of staff. And again, I think that intersects very nicely with the DSMLE project. So I'm sorry I took up more time, but Ben forecast that I would, but that's where we are.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Steve, that's it from us. Delighted to present those projects and obviously how they're continuing, and we're continuing to implement some of the S2A stuff in a new project and continuing to collect the stats. So yeah, we delighted to input that into the project. It can be used as a reference and inform the bid, but also the project going forward. So back to you.
Thank you ever so much, both. A really informative piece of work in both instances, and hopefully for colleagues that have not seen any of that, that gives you a little springboard to jump into the materials that we've shared with you. There's some fantastic work that has been completed. The national reports with the ESSA Sport project are really informative, and I think for this project gives a good benchmark and baseline for some of the conversations that we'll have over the coming months. I think it is important, as I said earlier on, to have that sobering reality of where we are right now. And Jeff, you are right. The statistics maybe just give us an insight of what might be happening, might not necessarily be the reflective of what's actually happening on the ground. So we do need to hold that in our thoughts.